All right, let's talk about the Cold War. But we're going to look at it from a totally different angle. Forget what you think you know for a second, because today we're following the money. When you hear Cold War, what pops into your head? It's usually this stuff, right? Spies, the constant threat of the bomb, this huge ideological showdown between communism and capitalism. That's the story we all know. Okay, but what if that's just, half the picture? What if that massive, world-splitting conflict that defined an entire century, what if it was really forged in treasuries and boardrooms just as much as in war rooms? What if, at its heart, it was really a war of wallets? So to really get this, we've got to rewind the clock. Let's go back to the last few years of World War II. Now, the US and the Soviet Union, they were allies, yeah, but it was a partnership of necessity. A classic the enemy of my enemy is my friend situation, not some deep-seated friendship. And man, you can see just how fast things went south. I mean, the switch from working together to full-on confrontation, it was a nosedive. And as we'll see, at pretty much every single step of the way, there was a big economic reason pushing things along.
It's kind of ironic, right? Because during the war, money and resources were actually the glue. Take the American Lend-Lease program. It was pumping a ton of vital supplies into the Soviet Union. It was a purely practical deal. American factories helping to power the Soviet war machine on the Eastern Front.
But here's the key thing, and the source material is super clear about this. This cooperation was just a tool. It was, and I'm quoting here, temporary and instrumental. It was all about winning the war. They had zero, and I mean zero, shared ideas about how the global economy should look after the dust settled. And that right there is the whole story. So, what happens when the war is over? Well, exactly what you'd expect. That temporary alliance just shatters. The common enemy is gone, and suddenly there are two totally different, competing visions for the world's economic future rushing in to fill that power vacuum. And this is where the collision course is set. You've got the US dreaming of a global economy with open markets and free trade. They're thinking, a rich world is a stable world that'll buy American stuff. Then you've got the Soviet Union, which was just completely wrecked by the war. Their plan was way more direct and, frankly, brutal. Squeeze Germany for every penny in reparations and lock down Eastern Europe as a security buffer. I mean, these two plans couldn't be more different. They were destined to clash. Let's dig into the American side for a second. This wasn't just some noble, idealistic vision. Not at all. It was pure self-interest. A recovered Europe meant a huge new market for all the goods America was producing. Plus, they were terrified of history repeating itself. Everyone remembered how the Great Depression led to absolute chaos and eventually another world war. Economic stability wasn't just a goal, it was a survival strategy. Okay, now let's flip the coin and look at it from the Soviet point of view. You really can't overstate the level of devastation they suffered. We're talking tens of millions of people dead, entire industrial regions just gone. So for Stalin, priority number 1, 2, and 3 was rebuilding. And in his eyes, Germany was going to be the ATM for that project. So when the West comes in with these grand recovery plans, he doesn't see a helping hand. He sees a plot to take over Europe and cheat the Soviets out of their reparations. So you have these two big clashing ideas. But ideas need a place to fight, right? A physical location. And that place was Germany. It became ground zero, the fault line where this economic rivalry exploded into a real, tangible, and incredibly dangerous crisis. And the big weapon the Americans brought to this fight? The Marshall Plan. On the surface, it looked great. The U.S. offered billions of dollars to help rebuild Europe. The official story was all about recovery and helping people. But let's be real, the strategic play was to build up strong, stable, capitalist countries that would act as a firewall against communism. Stalin, of course, saw right through that. He didn't see a gift. He saw a trap. He famously called it economic imperialism. To him, it was a Trojan horse, a clever way to get European nations hooked on American money, making them puppets in an anti-Soviet alliance. So what did the Soviets do? They built their own wall, an economic one. They basically forced all the countries in their sphere of influence in Eastern Europe to say no thanks to the Marshall Plan. In its place, they set up their own rival system, a whole block of state-controlled economies that would eventually be called Comecon. It was their version of a trading bloc, the total opposite of the West's free markets. The economic Iron Curtain was literally falling into place. And then came the flashpoint, the moment it all boiled over. It's 1948. The Western powers, trying to jumpstart the economy in their zones of Germany, do something that seems pretty sensible. They introduce a new currency, the Deutschmark, to create some stability. To them, it was just a practical move. But the Soviets, they didn't see it that way at all. They saw it as a declaration of economic war. In their minds, this was the West's first step toward creating a separate, strong West German state right on their doorstep, a huge threat. They knew they couldn't respond with tanks without kicking off World War III. So they fought fire with fire, using an economic weapon of their own. And that weapon was the Berlin blockade. Just like that, they cut off every road, every railway, every canal leading into West Berlin. The goal was simple: squeeze the city, starve the Western allies out, and force them to back down. Think about that. A dispute over currency had just spiraled into one of the scariest, most high-stakes confrontations of the entire Cold War. So let's pull back for a second. What's the big takeaway here? It's that these rival economic plans didn't just create some friction. No, they actually built the structure of the Cold War. They laid the foundation. When you get right down to it, economics wasn't just some subplot in this drama. It was the main engine. It's what took that initial post-war mistrust and basically poured concrete over it, hardening it into a permanent global rivalry. It created two completely different economic universes, each with its own gravity, its own rules. The conflict over money is what made the Cold War's division so real and so durable. And don't think for a second this was just a European problem. Oh no, this economic rivalry went global fast. All those proxy wars you hear about in Asia, Africa, Latin America, they weren't just about who had the bigger army. They were battlegrounds for competing economic systems. It was capitalism versus communism playing out all over the planet. And that kind of brings us to today, doesn't it? It leaves you with a pretty big question. When you look at the world now, all the trade wars, the fights over who controls the next wave of technology, the competing infrastructure projects across the globe, it really makes you wonder. Maybe the uniforms and the flags have changed, but is the fundamental conflict still the same? Are we still fighting a war of wallets? Definitely something to think about.